Good morning. We're back for episode 73, reading about 10 minutes a day from the Anarchist Handbook, organized by Michael Malice. And we are reading from Murray Rothbard, Anatomy of the State, 1974, in chapter 20. And we're a little bit into it, so we're starting toward the bottom of page 286. And we'll get reading. This section that we're starting today is titled, How the State Preserves Itself. Once a state has been established, the problem of the ruling group or caste is how to maintain their rule. While force is their modus operandi, their basic and long-run problem is ideological. For in order to continue in office, any government, not simply a, quote, democratic government, must have the support of the majority of its subjects. This support, it must be noted, need not be active enthusiasm. It may well be passive resignation, as if to an inevitable law of nature. But support in the sense of acceptance of some sort it must be. Else the minority of state rulers would eventually be outweighed by the active resistance of the majority of the public. Since predation must be supported out of the surplus of production, it is necessarily true that the class constituting the state, the full-time bureaucracy and nobility, must be a rather small minority in the land, although it may, of course, purchase allies among important groups in the population. Therefore, the chief task of the rulers is always to secure the active or resigned acceptance of the majority of the citizens. Of course, one method of securing support is through the creation of vested economic interests. Therefore, the king alone cannot rule. He must have a sizable group of followers who enjoy the prerequisites of rule. For example, the members of the state apparatus, such as the full-time bureaucracy or the established nobility. But this still secures only a minority of eager supporters. And even the essential purchasing of support by subsidies and other grants of privilege still does not obtain the consent of the majority. For this essential acceptance, the majority must be persuaded by ideology that their government is good, wise, and at least inevitable, and certainly better than other conceivable alternatives. Promoting this ideology among the people is the vital social task of the, quote, intellectuals. For the masses of men do not create their own ideas, or indeed think through these ideas independently. They follow passively the ideas adopted and disseminated by the body of intellectuals. The intellectuals are therefore the opinion molders in society. And since it is precisely a molding of opinion that the state most desperately needs, the basis for age-old alliance between the state and the intellectuals becomes clear. It is evident that the state needs the intellectuals. It is not so evident why intellectuals need the state. Put simply, we may state that the intellectual's livelihood in the free market is never too secure, for the intellectual must depend on the values and choices of the masses of his fellow men, and it is precisely characteristic of the masses that they are generally uninterested in intellectual matters. The state, on the other hand, is willing to offer the intellectuals a secure and permanent berth in the state apparatus, and thus a secure income and the panoply of prestige. For the intellectuals, it will be handsomely rewarded for the important function they perform for the state rulers, of which group they now become a part. The alliance between the state and the intellectuals was symbolized in the eager desire of professors at the University of Berlin in the 19th century to form the, quote, intellectual bodyguard of the House of Hohenzollern. In the present day, let us note the revealing comment of an eminent Marxist scholar concerning Professor Wittfogel's critical study of ancient Oriental despotism. Quote, the civilization which Professor Wittfogel is so bitterly attacking was one which could make poets and scholars into officials. Of innumerable examples, we may cite the recent development of the science of strategy, in the service of the government's main violence-wielding arm, the military. A venerable institution, furthermore, it is the official or court historian, dedicated to purveying the rulers' views of their own and their predecessors' actions. Many and varied have been the arguments by which the state and its intellectuals have induced their subjects to support their rule. Basically, the strands of argument may be summed up as follows. A. The state rulers are great and wise men. They rule, quote, by divine right. They are, quote, the aristocracy of men. They are the, quote, scientific experts. Much greater and wiser than the good, but rather simple subjects. And B, rule by the extant government is inevitable, absolutely necessary, and far better than the indescribable evils that would ensure upon its downfall. The union of church and state was one of the oldest and most successful of these ideological devices. The ruler was either anointed by God or, in the case of the absolute rule of many Oriental despotisms, was himself God. Hence, any resistance to his rule would be blasphemy. The state's priestcraft performed the basic intellectual functions of the state's priestcraft performed the basic intellectual function of obtaining popular support and even worship for the rulers. Another successful device was to instill fear of any alternative systems of rule or non-rule. The present rulers, it was maintained, supply to the citizen an essential service for which they should be most grateful: protection against sporadic criminals and marauders. For the state, to preserve its own monopoly of predation, did indeed see to it that private and unsystematic crime was kept to a minimum. The state has always been jealous of its own preserve. Especially has the state been successful in recent centuries in instilling fear of other state rulers. Since the land area of the globe has been parceled out among particular states, one of the basic doctrines of the state was to identify itself with the territory it governed. Since most men tend to love their homeland, the identification of that land and its people with the state was a means of making natural patriotism work to the state's advantage. If Ruritania was being attacked by Moldavia, the first task of the state and its intellectuals was to convince the people of Ruritania that the attack was really upon them and not simply upon the ruling caste. In this way, a war between rulers was converted into a war between peoples, with each people coming to the defense of its rulers in the erroneous belief that the rulers were defending them. This device of nationalism has only been successful in Western civilization in recent centuries. It was not too long ago that the mass of subjects regarded wars as irrelevant battles between various sets of nobles. Many and subtle are the ideological weapons that the state has wielded through the centuries. One excellent weapon has been tradition. The longer that the rule of a state has been able to preserve itself, the more powerful this weapon. For then, the X dynasty, or the Y state, has the seeming weight of centuries of tradition behind it. Worship of one's ancestors, then, becomes a none too subtle means of worship of one's ancient rulers. The greatest danger to the state is independent intellectual criticism. There is no better way to stifle that criticism than to attack any isolated voice, any raiser of new doubts, as a profane violator of the wisdom of his ancestors. Another potent ideological force is to deprecate the individual and exalt the collectivity of society. For instance, since any given rule implies majority acceptance, any ideological danger to that rule can only start from one or a few independently thinking individuals. The new idea, much less the new critical idea, must needs begin as a small minority opinion. Therefore, the state must nip the view in the bud by ridiculing any view that defies the opinions of the mass. Quote, listen only to your brothers, or, quote, adjust to society. thus become ideological weapons for crushing individual dissent. By such measures, the masses will never learn of the non-existence of their emperor's clothes. It is also important for the state to make its rule seem inevitable. Even if its reign is disliked, it will then be met with passive resignation, as witness the familiar coupling of, quote, death and taxes. One method is to induce historiographical determinism, as opposed to individual freedom of will. If the X dynasty rules us, this is because the inexorable laws of history or the divine will, and these are all capitalized, inexorable laws of history is capitalized, or divine will capitalized, or the absolute capitalized, or the material productive forces capitalized, have so decreed, and nothing any puny individuals may do can change this inevitable decree. It is also important for the state to inculcate in its subjects an aversion to any, quote, conspiracy theory of history. For a search for, quote, conspiracies means a search for motives and an attribution of responsibility for historical misdeeds. If, however, any tyranny imposed by the state, or venality, or aggressive war was caused not by the state rulers, but by mysterious and arcane social forces, or by the imperfect state of the world, or if in some way everyone was responsible, quote, we are all murderers, proclaims one slogan, then there is no point to the people becoming indignant or rising up against such misdeeds. Furthermore, an attack on, quote, conspiracy theories means that the subjects will become more gullible in believing the, quote, general welfare reasons that are always put forth by the state for engaging in any of its despotic actions. A, quote, conspiracy theory can unsettle the system by causing the public to doubt the state's ideological propaganda. The song remains the same. Actually, that's not in there, but we're about halfway down on page 290, and it just kind of struck me as same old here in 2021. And we'll be back probably tomorrow for another 10 minutes-ish a day reading the Anarchist Handbook, organized by Michael Malice from that heroic Murray Rothbard.